Hey guys, iKailaKai here, and today I want to do a slightly different video from what I usually do, and that is a deck profile. This may not be the normal setting that you have a deck profile in, but I have a very logical reason for this. Let's take a look at my background. Blue and black. What leader comes to mind when you think of these colors? That's right, everyone's favorite, Rebecca. I decided to bring Rebecca to a few tournaments in OP10, and I did fairly well in these. Now, first I want to talk about why I chose to bring Rebecca over Usopp. Usopp is also a blue-black leader with the type Dressrosa, so you would think that he is the obvious choice as he can attack and also has a similar effect of drawing cards when your characters die compared to Rebecca, who can draw cards on her turn with one Dong. The reason why I brought Rebecca to these tournaments and not Usopp is because I think that they're actually very different decks. Usopp has the ability to use 7-cost Rebecca. 7-cost Rebecca, because your leader makes her 8-cost, allows you to use the on-play effect, which allows you to play a 7-cost and a 4-cost. This, combined with something like 8-cost Moria, allows you to just make your board very large. Rebecca not only cannot use the 7-cost Rebecca, but also can't attack, making it so that swarming the board doesn't actually help her as much as someone like Usopp would. In this way, Rebecca can't play in the same way that Usopp wants to, because Rebecca just simply does what Usopp does, but worse. So, the way that you're going to want to play Rebecca is to play through controlling the board. Rebecca is one of the very few dual color leaders that has 5 life. Not only this, but with her leader effect, she can, if she manages her hand correctly, draw 2 cards per turn. In this way, she has a massive number of resources over the opponent, and while someone like Lucci needs to be clearing the board every single turn to not let the opponent get ahead on tempo, Rebecca has a lot more time due to the fact that she just survives a lot better than every single other deck in the meta. So Rebecca having 5 life and insane survivability makes the Teach matchup and Shanks matchup fairly good. Not only this, but the Doflamingo matchup is totally fine thanks to the new cards in 4-cost Zoro and 7-cost Kyros. As such, with these 3 decks in mind as the meta, I decided to bring Rebecca to my tournaments. The one thing that I did not anticipate, though, is that Rebecca actually has, unfortunately, a pretty bad Usopp matchup. I went to 3 tournaments at the time of testing this deck seriously. 2 of them were locals, and 1 of them was a flagship battle in Japan. In my first local, I went 4-0, and this was the list that I used. I believe this is a pretty standard start for Rebecca, maybe some cards like Slayman you don't see too much, but I'll be going over these cards in the full, complete list at the end. After this local that I won, I actually felt like I didn't really need Moria. There were a lot of times where, even if I had Moria, there were other plays that I felt were more important at the time, and as such, I decided to try taking it out, and this was the next list that I came up with. At my second local, I went 0-4. But the day after that, I changed my list a little bit more, went to my flagship battle, and went 4-1. I noticed that without Moria, I had a little bit less resources, although I did have more ways to clear the board. I don't think that Rebecca is complete yet, but I do think that this list is quite close to what I think would be how you'd probably start out with building Rebecca in this meta. So if you guys do want to try Rebecca, maybe consider one of the lists that I just showed. And now let's go into the discussion of each of the cards in the deck. Before I explain too much about this list, I want to talk about how significant the buffs to Rebecca actually are. Before, we had the 3-cost Kyros. You may be surprised that I don't actually run this, as it seems like the Rebecca card. However, I think that it's not actually needed in this list because something like 3-cost Brook just kind of does what he does, but better, and also has counter. The power of this card in OP04 came from the fact that it was a 3-cost 5000 that was not removable, that could also take back the opponent's board. However, in this meta, there are way too many cards that can just get rid of it. As such, Kyros' value has been very low recently, and we just needed solid KO cards. In the past, I would run things like 3-cost Kobe because the 3-cost I could KO a 3-cost is fairly good. However, we got something that's so much better in 4-cost Zoro. Zoro on his own KOs a 4-cost by himself without any setup, meaning that with any sort of cost reduction, you can just reach much higher ceiling. With Odoms, for example, you can reach up to an 8-cost, which means you can KO something like the opponent's Moria. This card alone makes it so much easier for someone like Rebecca or Usopp to be able to control the game, and is part of why this deck can now be played. So this is the deck list that I used on the day that I won this Jack card. I think that instead of going through these by order of cost, it's smart to go through this by the sort of logic in which they were included. First of all, I want to talk about Corrida Colosseum. This card is basically the core to the deck, as it lets you attack with your characters the turn that they're played. This, alongside things like 7-cost Kyros and 7-cost Luffy, even the 4-cost Zoro in some certain matchups, can be really helpful. Although Usopp and stuff will run 4 of these because they really need to find it in the early game, or else they do struggle a lot, Rebecca, because she can rest her leader, doesn't actually need this that urgently in the early game, and because Rebecca also doesn't have access to the 1-cost Dale to help her get rid of cards from her hand, or she doesn't use the 4-cost Cavendish as well as Usopp does, I have it at 3. I've had it at 3 since OP04, and this has always felt great for me. So I'm just keeping it like this, and so far it's been great for me. 4-cost Zoro being a 4-cost that can reach and KO up to a 4-cost by itself is just so strong, as it means that I don't need to combo with other sorts of cost reduction to actually be able to KO things. Because this card is so powerful, you basically end up using every single one that you end up drawing, and as such, I have it at 4. The 7 cost Luffy, in the most recent metas where something like Black Lychee has been a problem, this card absolutely sucked. Being 7 cost on its own that doesn't really do much on the turn that it's played really does not feel that good. However, as the more standard KO-focused black decks have been coming down in priority in Japan, this 7-cost Luffy is actually very strong. 6-cost Jozu and 7-cost Gravity Blade in Doflamingo can't reach it, and also a lot of Shanks' things, for example, the Rayleigh that can only KO a 6,000 power or less, can't end up reaching it. As such, this card ends up sticking really hard to the board and is very difficult to clear for a lot of decks. If Luffy can stay on the board and you have enough cards in your trash to facilitate his effect, then you can really use him quite well to keep taking back the board little by little and slowly chipping away at the opponent's hand, as he can attack active characters as well. I think that although this card is really great, because it only has 7,000 power and you need to have your trash filled up a lot, the card that you're generally going to be playing more in the early game is the 7-cost Kyros. Now, this 7-cost Kyros I only have 2 of, but I think that I can probably switch the counts of these to 2 Luffy and 3 Kyros, because a lot of the times on the 7 or 8 Dong, you'll choose to play the Kyros instead. The reason for this is because he's a 7-cost 9,000 base, which means that it's much easier for him to hit things with the Corrida Colosseum effect. And also he bounces back a 5-cost by himself, meaning that you just basically do a very similar thing to Luffy, where you're getting rid of one thing and attacking another one most of the time, but his effect is guaranteed and it keeps a 7-cost 9,000 on the board. He sticks to the board much better than something like Luffy does. As such, I think that Kyros is more important in the early game, and then once you can stabilize and play Luffy, Luffy's the one that'll end up ending the game. The next card that I want to talk about is the Searcher. The Searcher is just very standard at this point. I've debated in the past whether I need it or not, but just being able to access things like the 4-cost Zodal and the stage more consistently in the early game is very important, and as such I have it at 4. Not only this, but because Rebecca really relies on filling up her trash very quickly for things like the Torino Bastardo and the 7-cost Luffy, even if you miss the 1-cost Rebecca's on-play effect, she still dropped 3 cards into your trash, which makes it much better for a lot of your other cards in the deck. For 2,000 counters, I run 11. Generally, before I used to run 10, and that was when I was running all Dressrosa 2,000 counters. As I am running Tsuru, which is a navy, meaning that it can't be searched off of 1-cost Rebecca or my leader ability, I've put my 2,000 counters up to 11, and I feel like 12 is a little bit too much. I personally think that I don't need 3 Bartolome because it's very rare that you end up playing him onto the board, but he can be picked up by Rebecca, so I think that maybe putting him down to 2, and then you can maybe put in some more technical things, for example. I think that this Tsuru though is quite important because in the Usopp matchup, when the opponent plays their 7-cost Rebecca into 7-cost Kyros and Zoro, you can actually answer that very nicely with Tsuru and Gravity Blade to easily get rid of a 6 and an 8 cost. This combo is very nice and doesn't require any sort of setup beforehand, you just need to draw the card, and as such I think that is really good. Speaking of which, I think that Gravity Blade is absolutely one of the strongest cards in this deck, and is another reason why Rebecca, as a blue-black leader, stands out among the other black leaders. Gravity Blade bottoming 2 6-costs for only 7 dong, and you also have access to cost reduction in things such as Slayman, Tsuru, Soldier, Tempest Kick, just makes the card so powerful. And I think that this card could go up to 4, but I just have some counterless issues. The other KO event that I have is Torino Bastardo. Now, Torino Bastardo on its own still KOs a 4-cost, so on turns where you don't have the Zoro, but you really need to KO things, for example, against the Doflamingo matchup, it's solid to just shoot just to get rid of 1 target, and in the late game it ends up reaching up to 6. This means that if you have Orombus on the board, then you can use Orombus effect into Torino Bastardo and KO a 10-cost. Or you can use Sureimon. Sureimon, if the opponent has a rested character on the board, even if you're, of course, because this is only 4,000 power, you can still hit 4,000 power into something else and still get the on play and the on attack to therefore -4 cost. So for example, against the Shanks matchup, if you just have Slayman and Torino Bastardo in your hand, then you can KO a 10 cost out of hand and you don't need to set up anything with Orombus, for example. The reason why I still have Orombus in this deck, however, is because generally just having extra cost reduction, particularly minusing things by 4, is important. Because we now have Zoro in the deck, being able to reduce something's cost by 4 means that you can take up to an 8 cost. This means that you can take the opponent's 8 cost Moria. It also means that you can take the opponent's 7 cost Kyros in the Usopp matchup because, of course, it's going to be 8 costs on their turn. In this way, Just having more ways to be able to reduce things by 4 cost is very valuable. Another reason why I have Oronbus in this deck is because his effect is Activate Main. As such, even against Teach, where they're using their leader effect to lock my on-play effects, I can still Oronbus and then Toenlo Bastardo on the Tendong turn to be able to get rid of their 10 cost Teach. And Tempest Kick only reach up to 3. This means that with Zoro they only reach up to 7 costs, which I've noticed in my testing has been not quite there because there just aren't that many good 7 costs and there are a lot of good 5 costs. As such, generally I would end up using these cards to just get rid of a 5 cost, which felt pretty bad. As such, I might end up changing this Tempest Kick into something like Ice Age, for example, but they still are decent due to the fact that I run this one 3-cost Brook. With this 3-cost Brook and any sort of cost reduction, it's very easy for me to reach up to a 4 or 5 cost. The 4-cost Rebecca really helps stall out time and help regain resources into my hand. I think that one of the things that this deck has struggled with is just to maintain resources. As your board is not that powerful, but your defense is very high, you do end up running out of cards in your hand a little bit faster than you might otherwise. As such, I think just having more extra defense as well as being able to retrieve cards from your trash helps you really stay in the game, especially in the early game, where you're not really wanting to be playing these more combo-centric cards. Speaking of these stable blockers, I run Subble. Not many people run Subble recently, however I think that because the Rebecca deck, 1, does not have good ways to get rid of cards from their hand, and 2, they don't have the +1 cost from Usopp's leader ability. 5-cost Subble being a 5-cost is actually quite significant as it stays out of the range of a lot of the removal in this game. If it only had value in the last couple of turns, I think that 1 is fine, but because in the early game you can just drop it to sort of cycle your hand, fill up your trash, and then just put a blocker down that's going to stay on the board for quite a while, I think that it's good to have at 3, but having it at 4 means that you're going to end up drawing it when you don't really want to, taking the spot of things that could end up helping you more on the board immediately. This was the list that I ended up bringing to my tournament, and I did end up doing well. For now, let's just throw it back to Kai outside to talk about the matchups. Hey, welcome back. So now that we've gone over all the cards, let's briefly go over some of the meta matchups. There are way too many decks that you might see in the meta for me to actually talk about all of them, so I'm going to talk about 4 big ones that you might actually end up seeing. Now, Shanks' deck generally ramps up in power as the game goes on. As such, it means that there aren't too many things that the opponent's going to be playing in these early turns, say for something like Lucky Root if they play it, or 5-cost Ace. The biggest problem card in the early game is this 5-cost Ace because you cannot KO it, but you still can hit it. As such, generally the mulligan in this matchup is 7-cost Luffy. If you can have 7-cost Luffy in your hand, even when the opponent plays their 5-cost Ace and leaves it active, you can still hit it with Luffy and start to burn resources out of the opponent's hand. The goal in this matchup is to make it so the opponent runs out of resource in their hand so they can't defend their board anymore. As such, having 7-cost Luffy standing on the board on key turns, so for example when they play their 10-cost Shanks, you can just hit it twice very hard to clear it guaranteed. It makes it very hard for the opponent to actually stabilize in the game because you're just permanently drawing more cards than the opponent and are relatively healthy from the early game where you both are slightly weaker. However, the one time where you do want to leave Luffy active is when the opponent is planning to play Rayleigh. Before their 8-dong turn or 9-dong turn if they're going first, you want to leave Luffy active or even use the Activate Main to make sure that he stays active at the end of the turn so the opponent can't actually KO Luffy. Because he's 7,000 power, he cannot be KO'd with Rayleigh alone and would require a Building Snake or for Luffy to be rested for them to be able to then hit into the Luffy. As such, if you can leave Luffy active there, it'll basically stay for the entire rest of the game, and if the opponent decides to not play 10-cost Shanks on 10 and instead play Rayleigh to be able to help clear the 7-cost Luffy, it makes your game a lot easier. If they do end up clearing your 7-cost Luffy, you can just pivot to clearing the board with your events. This is the big difference between Usopp and Rebecca. Rebecca can survive very well into the late game even when the opponent starts playing their 10-cost 12,000 rush characters, and can also clear these 10 costs very well. Because the opponent runs out of fuel much faster thanks to 7-cost Luffy in the early game, and being able to clear their 10 costs in the mid to late game, eventually, although it will take time, once you start to stabilize and play more things like 7-cost Luffy or 7-cost Kyros, you can eventually push back and win the game. The second matchup I'm going to talk about, which although not as popular as he was in OP09, is still probably the strongest deck in the meta, is Doflamingo. Although you still want to find Korrida in your early hand or even your mulligan, it's not as important or crucial as it is for someone like Usopp. The main card that you're looking for in this matchup is the 4-cost Zoro. And as such, although you do want to find it in your early hand, I don't think it's required, and as such, I mulligan very hard for the 4-cost Zoro. Because there aren't that many ways of KOing things, and Zoro is so strong, just finding this Zoro really changes a lot of things because it's the difference between the opponent hitting you with the Weevil or not. By your 7 to 8 dong turn, you want to try to find your Sage so that you can use your 7 cost Luffy or 7 cost Kyros very well. By using these two cards very well and over, you can slowly win back the board thanks to these cards as well as the 4 cost Zoro being able to target 2 things on the board at once. By continuously targeting 2 things on the opponent's board at once, the opponent's hand will burn a lot faster than it usually would. I generally don't think this matchup is too hard. However, Doflamingo still can technically run you over if they hit you too hard and you don't have as many counterless. So if I do end up having a hand that's something like 4 cost Zoro, 7 cost Kyros, 7 cost Kyros, and 7 cost Luffy, although these are the cards that I don't want to keep this because I generally want to be countering out the early attacks so I can keep using my leader ability to easily defend the 5,000 and 6,000 power attacks. Although generally mono-black decks do very poorly in Teach, Usopp and Rebecca can actually do quite well thanks to the fact that they also have access to blue. For Usopp, from my testing so far, it's pretty close to 50-50, maybe slightly losing for Usopp, and it's generally because he has trouble getting rid of things like Jesus Bajis. As such, in this matchup, I think the most important card is Gravity Blade. I do think that this card could end up going up to 4 depending on the number of Teaches in the meta, but 3 is a very solid spot right now, and it's also very useful into a lot of other decks. There are 2 different ways that the Teach player can decide to play out the matchup. They can decide to play Kuzang, or they can play Burgess. If they play Kuzang, they're in threat of 7 cost Luffy, because obviously 7 cost Luffy can hit active characters. However, because Jesus Bajis is going to have something like 7, 8, 9,000 power, it's not very easy to take with Luffy, but it's very easy to take with things like Gravity Blade. In this way, having both cards in the deck help give you answers to both of the plans that Teach can take. And as such, these are the 2 cards that I generally want to find in the mulligan. Both of them can still be used even if the opponent uses their leader ability, making it very awkward for the opponent to choose what timings they want to use their leader ability on. However, they still do have to use their leader ability due to the fact that things like 7 cost Kyros, 4 cost Rebecca, 8 cost Moria have the threat of existing within these sorts of decks. The final matchup that I want to talk about is the Rebecca versus Usopp matchup. Usopp's very popular in this meta due to the fact that he's very simple in the way that he wants to move. However, he has a lot of complexity in when and what to counter with. However, Rebecca does struggle in this matchup from my testing so far. I think that Rebecca can end up winning this matchup, but it generally ends up going to time because it takes so long. Usopp has so many resources thanks to his leader ability and being able to run things like Moria and the 7 cost Rebecca, that it's very hard for Rebecca to turn the corner and eventually start taking back the opponent's life. As such, as Rebecca, you're clearing the board for 30 minutes, and although she can do this very well compared to Usopp, eventually if Usopp can draw enough 7 cost Rebeccas and 8 cost Morias, there's just too many things on the board for Rebecca to deal with, and it gets a little bit hard. For this reason, I think that the matchup is slightly difficult, but I do think that it is fightable if you can just survive for long enough, because for any obscure or hard matchup, if Rebecca can just survive until the opponent runs out of resources, she will end up winning. As such, in this matchup, I choose to go first to deny the opponent from playing their 7 cost Rebecca on 7 dong, and I try to make it so I can use my leader ability every single turn until 7 dong. This means on 1, I use my leader ability. On 3, even if I play a 2k counter just to be able to get to 6 cards in hand to use my leader ability, I will do that. On 5, there are 2 options. You can either play 5 cost Sable and then just cycle your hand helping you find some other cards, or you can play something like the 4 cost Rebecca and then the leader ability. The one thing you need to be careful about here is if you play the 4 cost Zoro. If you play the 4 cost Zoro here and the opponent answers with their own 4 cost Zoro, your Zoro can't clear theirs because it's 5 cost, but their Zoro can clear yours. As such, you don't want to be the first one playing your Zoros, so unfortunately that's part of why this matchup is difficult. On your 7 dong turn, by playing 7 cost Kyros, you can bounce them back to their hand. Even if it's something like the 4 cost Zoro or the 4 cost Cavendish, it doesn't really matter because you're just trying to reduce the opponent's number of attacks. The important cards in this matchup are to just focus on playing curve and then to eventually try to get your 7 cost Kyros to stick. It is much easier for 7 cost Kyros or 7 cost Luffy to stick for the Rebecca side compared to Usopp's side because Usopp doesn't have as many board clear tools as Rebecca has. As such, this matchup I do think you probably can win as Rebecca, maybe with a little bit more clicking. It's part of the reason why I ran so many Sables in my list, but I do think that it just takes so much time that in a general tournament where you have 30-minute time limit, where if you go over the time limit you both lose, it's probably a little bit losing for Rebecca because you end up needing to play a little bit faster, maybe needing to run something like King Kong Gun just to try to finish the game before the time runs out. It's my first time doing this kind of video, but if you did enjoy this deck profile, please let me know, and please let me know how I may be able to improve it for the future for you guys. In my last video, I said that I was trying to get to 10,000 subscribers by the end of this year. However, off of that video alone, I gained about 500 followers in one day, and now we've already reached 10,000. So, I put out a really long post on Twitter saying thank you to everyone already. I think doing that on YouTube is a bit too long for what YouTube favors. So I just want to say thank you, and let's just keep going, I guess. I'll keep trying to make everything better, and I hope you guys will be there with me. If you guys enjoyed, please make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Merry Christmas.